Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first CEPR Political Economy webinar. This is a seminar that we organized together with the CEPR Political Economy group, with Research and Policy Network on Conflict and Research and Policy Network on Populism. I am Sergey Guriev, I'm the leader of the Populism Network. We decided to organize this webinar to make up for many canceled seminars and conferences. And we're very happy that we have several hundred people registering for this first event. We will hold it every first Wednesday of each month. So we've already planned 2 more seminars. As you can check on the seminar's website, the next seminar will be given by Guido Tabellini and the one after by Ileana LaFerrara. But today we are very happy to have Daron Acemoglu, who of course in this group needs no introduction, but just let me say that Daron is an institute professor at MIT, and he is a recipient of many prizes, including, among others, John Bates Clark Medal from 2005. He's written several books, more precisely 5 books, including a very new book, The Narrow Corridor. But today he is given a normal research paper together with Giuseppe and Giacomo on war, socialism, and the rise of fascism in Italy. And without further ado, I'll now give floor to Daron, who will speak for 60 minutes, after which we'll have 15 minutes for discussion. During the talk, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Luckily, we have Giuseppe and Giacomo with us today, so they will be able to answer clarification questions on chat or Q&A, but occasionally we may also stop and unmute participants, unmute the audience for asking questions with the mic. Please raise your hands or signal on chat and Q&A that you want to speak, and then we'll let you speak either during the talk or more likely after Daron finishes presenting. So let me now give floor to Daron. Daron, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our first speaker in this new adventure. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Sergey, for that introduction. Thank you to Sergey, Dominic, Ronnie, Helios, and Maria Elena for organizing it. I can't say that it's a great pleasure to be giving a talk via Zoom relative to being there in person, but it's a great pleasure to be here nonetheless, given the circumstances, and also share the stage with Giuseppe De Feo and Giacomo De Luca, my co-authors on this. So let me share the screen again. So this is a fresh off the presses paper, meaning that it doesn't exist yet, but we've been working on it for quite a while, and hopefully a draft is imminent. But I think we have enough of a structure and results to be talking about it, sharing it with you right now. So the title is War, Socialism, and the Rise of Fascism, and it's about the interwar rise of fascism in Italy, which, we're almost at the centenary of the March of Rome and the fascists taking power in Italy. And we are seeing many different types of right-wing populist movements come to power or close to coming to power in many different parts of the world, from the US to Italy again, to Brazil, the Philippines, other parts of Europe. And many people are tempted to draw parallels between some of these movements and the early 20th century fascist movements. Even if such parallels may be stretched, it's undoubtedly true that we have quite a bit to learn from what happened during the interwar years. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for research, is that the causes of the rise of fascism, both in Italy and elsewhere in Germany, for example, are still poorly understood and hotly debated. So what we do in this paper is, differently from much of the historiography here, we take an empirical approach to shed light on on these aspects. So I'm not going to give a survey of theories of fascism, but they come from every corner: cultural, social, psychological, sociological, related to historical factors. But one that's central to our investigation, because that's the idea that we're going to be empirically investigating, as pointed out by some historians such as Ernst Nolte in Germany, but even sooner by some Marxist historians like Togliatti and others, that fascism, and especially the support it received from both the upper and the middle classes, might have been related to the threat of socialism. This was certainly the perspective of the Third International, that they saw fascism as a threat to, or as a reaction to the socialist movements, even if they at times overinterpreted the success of socialism. And certainly in Italy, the Red Scare was quite real, and there were many Italians in 1919 and 1920 who were worried about a socialist takeover. This perspective is not widely accepted by historians. Some historians strongly defend it, some of them criticize it. So it's actually useful to understand it in greater detail, again, both from a historical perspective, but also to see what sorts of parallels there are with today's movements. So I'll come back to that at the very end. The Italian context is interesting, not only because it's the first fascist government that formed the interwar years, but also the Red Scare was a real issue in Italy. There was a big chaos and mismanagement during the war, a huge amount of disappointment with the war in Italy. And the Italian Socialist Party, which was the main beneficiary of this backlash against the war, was not just hardline anti-war, but it was hardline in terms of its views. It's one of its most powerful wings, was strongly aligned with the Soviet-style communism, and many other parts of the Socialist Party had already organized strikes and takeovers of farmlands and so on. So there were widespread fears both in the urban areas and the rural areas, and for example, the famous historian Italian Fascism de Felice emphasizes how the landowning class was very afraid of Russian-style expropriation organized by the Socialist Party. So what we do in this paper is that we exploit the municipality level impact of World War I, which we first show as orthogonal to other things that happened. This was like a shock that was differential for different parts of Italy, how much discontent and discombobulation the war had created, and then link that first to the rise of socialist support in the 1919 election, and then from there trace its effect on fascist violence and ultimately to the big fascist victory in the 1924 election. So historians emphasize, such as Littleton, but many others, that the popular disorder and discontent was both a result of the haphazard nature of demobilization, but also because of the unhappiness that had been created by the war, which was itself not very much embraced by the population at large. Certainly not when it was when the London Pact was signed and Italy was thrown into the war. So we show that the casualties that different municipalities suffered seems to be as good as random, meaning that once you control for some basic aspects of where people served from the municipality, the number of casualties is uncorrelated with anything else, but it strongly predicts the socialist vote share in 1919. And then we show that there is a direct link between the socialist vote share in 1919 induced by this quote unquote exogenous source of variation from the casualties of foot soldier casualties. This traces to an effect on fascist organization, fascist violence, and fascist vote share. More specifically, we are going to estimate two-stage least squares models where the excluded instrument, which we're going to do a lot of work to show that it's justified to be excluded, that is going to predict the first stage, so to speak, which is the support for socialism early on. That's going to be the source of variation in the Red Scare. And then from there, we're going to do the two-stage least squares, which is the effect of this additional increase in the support for the Socialist Party on the later fascist vote share. The effects are large, but not implausible. I'll go through the magnitudes later. But one standard deviation increase in casualties increases the Socialist vote share about 3% in the 1919 election, and then one standard deviation increase in the Socialist vote share increases the fascist vote share in 1924 by 13%. Now, this source of variation may be intriguing to some people, but you may not immediately buy it. So you may worry that this is capturing other things. So we also try to do a particular type of validation to show that this is not implausible. So we focus on a different type of variation that led to an increase in the support for socialists, the very bad harvest of the 1920, which was driven by the near drought conditions in certain parts of Italy. And we show that this is somewhat less powerful than our foot soldier casualties, but it works very similarly, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative patterns. So adding a little bit of plausibility, hopefully. So, and then we do a little bit of an investigation of the mechanisms. And I think the most important part of the mechanism discussion is that we try to dismiss the story that people who voted for socialists were then turning around and voting for fascists. So it's not like discontented people were like a random walk voting for one extremist party versus another. In fact, we show there was no decline in the vote share of the Socialist Party, differential decline in the vote share of the Socialist Party in 1924. Instead, the fascist vote share came from a consolidation of the right-wing votes in the fascist party. And again, that's consistent with some historiography, although there is also a large number of authors arguing that the fascists had some socialist elements, etc. We don't get into those debates, but from an empirical point of view, the story we tell is very clear that there was no differential effect on the socialist vote share in 1929, but there was a huge differential consolidation of right-wing votes under the banner of the fascist party across municipalities. In terms of the more detailed mechanism, the picture is a little bit complicated, but it's again consistent with the historians' work. The early increase in the fascism, for example, violence in 1920 and 21, was very much related to support that the fascist movement received from landowners in rural areas. And that's exactly what we find. But then for the later vote increase, we see that it was mostly from the middle classes. So this is, for example, in Gentile's account, this new fascism was an expression of the mobilization of the middle classes, new to politics. Well, there's a big debate on this in the history literature. Some people denying this middle class theory of fascism, some people strongly supporting it. So our work suggests a slightly more nuanced picture that the early increase wasn't so much autonomous middle class in some sense. It had a strong element of support from elites and especially landowners, but then the later votes did have this middle class character. Now, we also look a little bit at some of the consequences of fascism, both short-term and long-term. One is we look at the deportation of Jews. Let me not spend too much time on this here because I want to come back to it when I present the results. But we do find that where there was this exogenous increase in local fascist support, more Jews were deported, or Jews were more likely to be deported. And then we also traced the long-run political implications of the rise of fascism. At some level, it's not surprising that they're not super major, because fascism was so thoroughly disreputed in Italy that it should not have a huge effect. But it does correlate with a subsequent decline, especially in the 3 decades following World War II, decline in the vote share of the Christian Democrats, mostly accounted for by an increase in the main left-wing party, the Communist Party, which was by that time no longer really communist. But there's also some evidence, less clear-cut, varying across elections, that even more extremist parties, both from the left and the right, received support. All right, well, I've already mentioned the historical literature as I was going along. Let me just flash this slide rather than spend time on it. Just the only point I want to make is that the Red Scare aspect of Italian history is very well developed, that a lot of people being very afraid of the rise of socialism during this process. And then there's a large literature in the context of economics, mostly from the German experience, looking at determinants of the support for German fascism. But let me not let me not spend more time on that. Let me pause here and see if there are any clarifying questions or.
Yeah, there have been many questions, Daron, but your co-authors have done a good job. But most of the questions are, would you address this or that factor? And your co-authors would say, yes, hopefully it's coming up in the presentation. So.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Pepe. Thank you, Giacomo.
Yeah, but so many good questions, but let's see if people still have these questions after I finish presenting.
Okay, great. So let me spend the next 5-10 minutes giving a potted history of what happened. And of course, this being the political economy group, Italians are overrepresented, and they don't want to be lectured by a non-Italian about Italian history, and I have no expertise. The only excuse I have is that I have 2 Italian co-authors, so you can blame them. So as people know, Italy was neutral at the beginning of the war, but there was a nationalist interventionist movement that wanted to get into the war. This wasn't super popular by Italians. The majority of the MPs and the population did not want to get into the war, and the Socialist Party took the most vocal position against the war. But there were big rallies organized by various nationalist groups in the spring of 1915. And there was a secret pact, the Pact of London, which made Italy join France and Britain against Austria and Germany. And this is generally viewed as a very scarring experience for Italy. It really divided the population into pro-war and anti-war, and I think it has had a persistent effect both during the war and in the aftermath of the war, which is relevant for the relevant context for what we're going to see. The Socialist Party, founded in 1892, was mostly a northern urban phenomenon, but also had very strong presence in some rural areas, the Po Valley, especially Sicily, on which Pepe, Giacomo, and I wrote an earlier paper. Arguably the most powerful branch of the party was pretty hardline. This is a time when many socialist parties were hardline in Europe, but Italian Socialist Party, perhaps even more so. So the statute that they adopted, for example, claimed the violent conquest of political power on behalf of the workers will signify the passing of power from the bourgeoisie to the proletarian class and establishing the dictatorship of all the proletariat. So the violent and forced expropriation was very much part of the agenda of this part of the Socialist Party. So it wasn't completely without any foundation that people were scared of a socialist government. And the 1919 elections brought a huge success for the socialists. They couldn't become the majority party, but they captured over 32% of the vote, almost doubling their vote share nationally. This was the first election with proportional representation. Manhood suffrage was already in the 1913 election. And then following the election, there were occupations of factories and farms all over Italy, and many of those demanded better conditions. But there were also demands again from the more Bolshevik part of the Italian Socialist Party or their allies, or for takeover of factories and land collectivization and so on. So Mussolini, of course, plays a central role in the rise of fascism. He was a leader of the Socialist Party, editor of Avanti newspaper of the Socialists, but then he was very pro-war, so he split with the Socialist Party, or expelled from the Socialist Party, and founded the Fasci di Combattimento, collective of veterans, combatants, and it was very much the spirit of the pro-war interventionist nationalists of the 1915. It was a very heterogeneous movement, and at times Mussolini himself did not have control over the fascist movement, but fascists from early on showed a commitment to street violence against socialists, even though Mussolini himself sometimes wavered on this point. Even though they were completely unsuccessful in the 1919 elections, part of the nationalist bloc by themselves, they started becoming a force to be reckoned with because of their military style structure and street violence. Again, in the words of Littleton, the novelty of fascism was its military, organizational, and violent structure. Let me not spend too much time on this, but the evidence is very clear that various weaknesses in the center-right government essentially made the fascist movement more and more important for center-right politicians, and wasn't only the voters, but center-right politicians themselves started sort of joining forces with the fascists in various different contexts, but especially against the socialists. Fascist violence really started blossoming starting in 1920, was pretty high, actually, much higher than in Germany around the same time, for example. There were over 700 killings by right-wing paramilitaries, or by the fascists, sorry, in Italy, compared to less than just about 350 in Germany during the same period. And then, of course, the critical thing is October 27, the March on Rome succeeds, and King Emmanuel appoints Mussolini prime minister. So that's an extremely brief history as background. So let me talk about some of the aftermath of the war. So the Italian war effort was disorganized, not super successful, despite the fact that Italians were on the side of the victors, and despite the fact that the Italians did not send as many troops as some other countries, they did suffer a lot of casualties, between 500,000 and 600,000. So we used the roll of honor to get the names, dates of births, and dates of places of all of these casualties. 80% or more of those are foot soldiers. The remainder are foot soldier, people who were in the shock troops, the RDT or other special troops. And we focus on the foot soldiers because the selection aspect of the RDT, where they come from, is more complex. And then we really want to focus on this random part of the casualties at the municipality level. So throughout, we're going to include control for which regiments the people from the municipality served, or more aggregated version of the regiments, and really look at the random number of casualties that one municipality versus another suffered. We've collected data on fascist violence based on Franzinelli's work, digitized these data, and as I mentioned, there are over 700 killings and over 2,500 other violent episodes. We also will use data on the local branches of the fascist party as an organizational aspect of where the fascist party got a more structured foothold. Some of the key data for us are the vote shares. Unfortunately, these are not readily available because they've gone missing from the parliamentary archives, but we collected the data from local and national newspapers and state archives, especially for the key elections of 1919, 1921, 1924, and the key aspect here is that we have fairly comprehensive data. We have it for about 6,000 municipalities out of 8,000. That's the best we could do. The best alternative source has it much for many fewer municipalities. And then we put together various controls, population. The most interesting one later will be the Jewish deportation data, which I'll describe when I come to it. So here is our sample. We have, for most of the variables, we have about 5,800 municipalities. The fascist vote share was less than 1% in 1919, partly because in some places fascists were part of the nationalist bloc. But in 1924, the average across our municipalities is over 61%, almost 62%. And that's comparable to the national vote share of the fascists. If you look at the socialist vote share, in 1913, the socialists had less than just about 16% of the vote. In 1919, they increased that to over 32%. The unweighted average in our municipalities is just under 32%. This still remains high in the 1921, about 26%, and then by 1924, it's down to where it was in 1913. Another point that I'll show you in maps also, if you look at the next column, you'll see that all of these vote share variables have a huge variance. These are vote shares in parliamentary elections. So they're voting for the same lists, but some places are much more favorable to the left, some places are much more favorable to the right. So the standard deviation of the socialist vote share, for example, is 27% in 1919, and the standard deviation of the fascist vote share in 1924 is about 26%. And then finally, you also see the foot soldier casualties. They are on average about 3% of the population with a standard deviation of 1.5%. So here is just a visual representation of the data. The green is the foot soldier casualties, and the red is the socialist vote share. You see that there is a lot of micro variation in the foot soldier mortality. So within a province, some places are very dark green, some places are very, very light green, meaning very few casualties. And for a socialist vote share, you can see there is more concentration. Provinces are politically more aligned than a little bit more aligned than the casualty distribution, but there is also a lot of variation even within provinces or micro areas. You see the sort of stronghold in the north of the socialists, for example, in the very dark red. Now in this picture,
there was a question from Kevin O'Rourke, which directly applies to this picture. He was asking if missing municipalities are random or non-random, and you see you seem to have no data for some clusters of
that's right. They're not random. They're not random. They are the places where Giacomo and Pepe can provide a better answer to that, but they're the places where we could not get newspaper or state archive coverage. Yes, very good question, and so thanks for raising that. Unfortunately, that's the case. But on the other hand, fortunately, we do cover sort of the heartland of both the socialist support and the later fascist support, the north, the Po Valley, parts of Sicily, Rome, and so on. And so here is the same thing with the fascist vote share. You see that has a somewhat different distribution than the socialist vote share, which is not surprising, but we're going to see that there is a lot of correlation in the component of the socialist vote share induced by the casualties and the fascist vote share. All right, without further ado, let me show you our main specifications, starting with the first stage, which is how these war casualties impacted socialist support in 1919. So all of the tables I'm going to present, except a few ones where we cut it down for making it more manageable, will have these 6 specifications. The first column is the most basic one, which includes the things that we think should always be there. And then the 6th column is the most loaded one, where we include everything that we thought could be relevant. So in the first specification, we have province fixed effects, regiment fixed effects, and demographic controls, which are log population as a quartic and percent of the population less than 6. We don't have more detailed age controls from the census, but that fraction of the population less than 6% in 1911 is essentially the age range that's just at the war serving age at the end of the war, and the very young in both the 1919 and 1924 elections. So in the first column, you see a very strong correlation between these foot soldier casualties and the socialist vote share in 1919. It's, as a first stage F statistic, is over 40%, or a T statistic of almost 7. And we see that this pattern and the quantitative magnitude is fairly stable across columns. So let me go, let me go through the columns just briefly to give you a sense of the variables that we include, because I think some of those are relevant for a few questions that some of you might have. So the second column includes a bunch of geographic controls, in particular elevation of the city center of the municipality, maximum elevation and area, so that we're also effectively controlling for density. That has no effect on the coefficient. The third column potentially is more important because there might be selection in where individuals were sent, or what other types of experiences they underwent during the war. That may be a relevant source of variation, but it may also be correlated with the nature of the population. For example, younger population or more urban population in some areas. So we control for those just as a robustness. So we control for dummies for deaths from special assault soldiers, the RDT, of volunteers, and those for in the highest casualty wars. The fourth column, that leads to a slightly smaller coefficient, but not big difference, and a little bit more precision. The fourth column controls for agriculture. That's very important when we look at some agricultural rural support for the fascists, and also some of the economic variables that I'll show you in a second. And So the percent of day laborers, sharecroppers, and the landlord associations, that's the big old-style landowners having formed an association. That has political importance, we'll see. Doesn't change things much. And then we also control for socialist vote share in 1913 in the same third column, together with the military controls, and then also add a bunch of urban controls, percent of industrial workers per capita, literacy rate, percent of elites, and so on. So the bottom line is that for whatever interpretation, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into the interpretation, there is this very strong correlation between foot soldier casualties, especially the random component as we are interpreting it, and the socialist vote share in 1919. And since in the later columns we're controlling for the socialist vote share in 1913, the way to interpret that is that this is the additional vote share that the Socialist Party gained after the war. Again, our interpretation related to the demobilization and the traumatic experience of the war, reaction to the war, that an unpopular war led to these casualties from the local area. Nevertheless, it is quite possible that these foot soldier casualties, share of the population that's foot soldier casualties, might be correlated with lots of other things which could then indirectly lead to the socialist vote share. So that's what we're going to investigate. But before I do that, let me show you this relationship visually. This is a bin scatter plot. Each dot is about 130 municipalities. And you have the average foot soldier casualties on the horizontal axis for the bin, and the socialist vote share 1919 on the vertical axis for the bin. And this is from the sixth column, the most loaded specification. So the covariates are partialed out already. So you see that the relationship is essentially fairly stable across the distribution of foot soldiers. It's not driven by one group of municipalities versus another. It's not like an outlier driven type thing. In terms of magnitudes, as I said in the introduction, this is fairly large, but not implausible. One standard deviation increase in the share of foot soldiers leads to about 3 percentage point increase in the socialist vote share. Given the huge amount of variation in socialist vote share, as I pointed out, across Italy, this 2.8 percentage point increase is just about 10% of one standard deviation of socialist vote share. All right. So in this table, what we do is we show you that foot soldier casualties are not correlated with a bunch of things that you might worry about creating omitted variable bias. So let me actually start from the bottom three panels, panel B, panel C, panel D. Those are essentially all variables that are predating World War I, but they may still be correlated with foot soldier casualties if the casualties had a geographic pattern due to selection or other factors. And in all cases, there is no correlation. Here we are showing, just for brevity, the most loaded specification, but in the paper we show other specifications as well. The lack of correlation is pretty uniform. Most tellingly, there is no relationship with industrial workers, how many industrial firms there are, how many strikes or how many striking workers there were in 1913, whether there's a large landowner association or other aspects of the agricultural, or if you go back in history, that's when we have the data on violent crimes or crime rates and so on. Now, if you come to panel A, Well, the fourth column in panel A is still like the other ones, it's literacy. So it's again a pre-existing characteristic. So the other first three columns are also relevant. So the first one shows that the socialist vote share in 1913 is uncorrelated with the casualties. The coefficient there, as you can see, is about 1/10 or 1/8 of the coefficient and is far from significant. And the next two columns are particularly interesting as well. They show that despite the fact that there were some very nationalist workers like the RDT or the volunteers, the foot soldier casualties were not correlated with fascist support in 1919 and the nationalist support in 1919. That doesn't deny that there were some veterans that were very strongly nationalist, but the municipalities' vote share wasn't particularly correlated. And that's partly, we argue, because first we are focusing on these drafted foot soldier casualty, and secondly, because this is the sort of the random element of where people suffered from the war, and our interpretation is that made them more anti-war, not more pro-war. So we take this as support for this interpretation, which is underlying the whole sort of edifice of the paper. Let me stop here before I jump to the two stagely squares and see if there are any questions and comments.
Yeah, there are plenty of questions, Daron. Thanks. So quite a few people asked a question about exclusion restrictions regarding the fact that indeed fascism was built on veteran associations. And so you may have a direct link from casualties to fascism bypassing socialism. And the other question, let me ask it right away as well, is this question just raised by Luigi Pascali, who says that maybe in more nationalistic, in places with more pre-existing nationalism, you would have more nationalistic individuals who would die more in the war because they are happy to sacrifice themselves and they do not hide, do not desert, and so on. These are a couple of questions.
Yeah. So I think those are both excellent questions, and those are things to worry about, absolutely. The main argument that we have, which is, of course, not complete, not completely dispositive, but if that were the case, you would already expect some effect in the 1919 election, either on the fascist vote share or the nationalist vote share, and neither of which, those are the circled ones here, we find. Instead, these casualties are most strongly correlated with the socialist vote share. Now, the main reason for that is because, again, I think we are focusing on the aspect of the war, the casualties of foot soldiers, that was at the root of the negative feelings about the war, not about how many people served and how many people were in the RDT or the volunteers, etc. Now, it's an interesting question. We haven't looked at that, is whether, for example, RDT are correlated with the fascist vote share in 1919, for example. We could look at that.
There was also a discussion in the Q&A regarding the fascist vote in 1919, since fascists were only present nationwide in 1924, and in 1919 they were only present in a few provinces. So in that sense, probably nationalist vote may be more convincing.
Yes, so that's why we do both of them, both the nationalists and the fascists. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Uh-oh. What happened here? How do I get rid of this? Clear. Okay, yes. Okay. So without further ado, let me jump into the main two stagely squares results. And if we were to go chronologically, I would show you the violence and the local branches first. But let me start with the bottom line, which is the fascist vote share, and then come to the rest. So so this table has exactly the same structure, exactly the same covariates, but now it's the two-stage least squares. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First, you see again a fairly strong, fairly precise effect across the specifications, not at the same level of precision, but about t-statistic of about 2.8 or so in most columns. This corresponds to the effect of the vote share of the Socialist Party in 1919 on the fascist vote share in 1924. I forgot to say it, I should have said it already in the previous table. The standard errors throughout are clustered at the province level, district level. But that may or may not be sufficiently conservative. So in the paper, we also do spatially adjusted Connelly standard errors. So here we are showing those in square brackets, and you see that those are actually less conservative. So the standard errors we're reporting are slightly higher, about 10% higher than the Connelly standard errors. So that doesn't say that either of these two is the final word on the spatial correlation of the vote shares, which is complex as you saw from the picture, but that's not driving our results. Let me come to the quantitative magnitude in a second, but what I want to highlight here is that whether you control for the military controls or the earlier socialist vote share, which is like the ideological leaning of the municipality, the coefficient on the socialists in 1919 is fairly stable. If you compare the IV to the OLS, you see a big difference, and I'll come to that in a second. The OLS is essentially zero everywhere. Now, let me show you the other two outcomes. Here, just for brevity, I'm showing you 3 of the specifications and then the 6 specifications. The first 3 columns are fascist local branches, and the next 4 are for fascist violence squadrismo. So the same pattern is visible, and more or less at the same level of precision, a little bit less in the case of fascist violence. And the interpretation of these 2 variables, I'll come back to that in a second again, but essentially the fascist local branch is about the organization of the fascist party, where the fascist party was able to get a stronghold early on. So that really related to support that they received from local elites, for example, because monetary support, we'll see that. And then the columns 4, 5, 6 is really these squadres violence against socialists. This had many, many reasons. Some of the local squadre RAS, the branch commanders, were more violent, less violent. There is some variation in this, but the source of the popularity of the fascist party was very much related to, in the eyes of some, including some veterans, in the violence that they meted out against socialists. And you see that in places where the socialists got this boost from war-related source of variation, there was more of the violence. And again, across different columns, the point estimates are very stable, and I'll come back to the quantitative magnitude in a second. In the bottom there, you see the OLS. I'm not showing you this Connelly standard errors. It's, again, similar, slightly lower, just to make the table more compact. If you look at the OLS, now there is a significant relationship, but much smaller. And again, I'll comment on that in a second. Here is the same bin scatter plots. you can see the relationship is a little bit more variable for the reasons that I've pointed out earlier than the much tighter relationship with the socialist vote share, but it's again not driven by outliers. It's fairly consistent across the range of the socialist vote share. What about the what about quantitative magnitudes? Well, the quantitative magnitudes are similar in some sense to the one for socialists, but let me formulate it differently. One standard deviation increase in socialist vote share in 1919 now leads to about a 13 percentage points increase in the fascist vote share. Again, because the fascist vote share is so variable, 13% is about 50% of its standard deviation. And similarly, large effects in the probability of having a local branch and the amount of fascist violence in the municipality. By the way, I forgot to say that in the previous slide, but fascist violence is for the 1920-22 period, which is after 1922, fascist violence doesn't end, but this is the period of the Squadrismo because this is before the March of Rome and the fascists come into government. So this is decentralized violence, you know, tolerated by the police in many areas, but not by the state. So why is the OLS so different, especially for the vote share in 1924, but also for the other? We think that's actually a feature, not a bug. The OLS between 1919 socialist vote share and 1924 fascist vote share captures the overall support for socialists. So some places, as I showed you in the map, are more left-wing, and they're never gonna vote that much for the fascists. Whereas our hypothesis is not that more left-wing places will suddenly support fascists. It's very different from the theories that, you know, were propagated by James Gregor and then some right-wing historians later on, that fascism and socialism were the same thing. It's more that the increase, an exogenous increase in the fascist vote share, socialist vote share, induced middle classes and sometimes the elites to fall behind the fascists. So for that, OLS is exactly the wrong thing and shouldn't capture that, and the IV should, and that's exactly what we're finding.
Daron, can I interrupt you here because a lot of people are asking this question?
This is a good place to interrupt.
Can you look in the OLS? Can you look at the change between pre-war and 1919, and look at the OLS where you don't look at the historically left wing, but like the change which happened during the war?
Well, we are essentially doing that. We could do it more explicitly. That's a good idea. But if you look at the
you do it for province fixed effects, but not municipality.
No, but if you look at this specification here, the third column onwards, it's controls for socialist vote share in 1913.
Mm-hmm. In OLS as well.
In OLS as well.
Oh, okay.
So it's essentially the in addition. But despite that, you know, the overall ideological leanings of some places changed a lot because the Socialist Party was becoming more. So the changes are endogenous as well as the levels.
Okay. And another question that people ask is, your story is about fascists reacting to the rise of Red Scare or the rise of the socialists, but some people are also looking at the violence and ask whether maybe voters were intimidated and scared by the fascist violence by year 2024. And it's not enthusiastic support for fascist ideas, but more like a fear of fascist violence.
That's a good question. It's a possibility, but I mean, 62% was pretty high, and but on the other hand, by this point, the fascists were in government. They were controlling, not completely, but they were controlling some local branches of the government and the police. So that is a good question. But for that reason, these two outcome variables are cleaner because they are before the March over Rome. So they are showing the fascist violence and the fascist local organization very cleanly in that sense. All right, well, I have, I think about 6 minutes. So let me zoom through a few things. Well, the first is we do this validation to say, well, perhaps there are aspects of this story, like the one that Sergey you just asked about other things might be going on, that may make you only 80% convinced. No, I'm kidding, 10% convinced. But if our story is correct, if there was another exogenous variation in socialist vote share, another shock, that should have the same effect. So we focus on rainfall, especially in 1920, there was very bad harvest. It wasn't just caused by bad weather conditions, by a variety of factors, but in some places there were near drought conditions, which really contributed to it. And experts and government sources at the time viewed the 1920 as like the worst agricultural year in more than a decade. So we create relative rainfall, meaning relative to your past, because some places always have lower rainfall. That's exactly what we did in our Sicily paper when we looked at the effect of the local socialist peasant organizations on the mafia. And then we cap it at 1 so that we're not looking at rainfall being more than normal. And here is the first stage, but now the variable is the socialist vote share in 1921. And it's less precise, as I pointed out, and you're not seeing T statistics of 7 or 8 anymore, but still pretty precise. And then if you do the same thing in terms of falsification, this rainfall is orthogonal to all the same things that I showed you foot soldiers were orthogonal to. And then finally, the outcome variables. We're looking at the fascist vote share in 1924. Now, the other things like 21, etc., are now too soon, so it's really the fascist vote share that's more relevant here. And for comparison, I'm showing you now in panel B the IV with foot soldier casualties, except that the intervening variable is now 1921, not 1919. And you see that the not only the socialists' vote share in 1921 induced by near drought conditions positive, exactly like what we had predicted, but it's also magnitude-wise very, very close to what you get from the war-related variation. And you see, as I pointed out at the beginning, that this source of variation is less precise. In some specifications, it's only significant at 10%. The first stage is weaker. So in the future, we should do, standard errors that are robust to weak instruments. We haven't done that yet, but that's essentially. But the overall picture that the magnitudes are very similar is what I wanted to emphasize here. So one question that anybody who read the historiography and the debates will immediately ask is it that socialists, people who voted for socialists, turned around and voted for fascists in some systematic manner? You go from one extreme to the other. So this table shows that's not the case. Either with the rainfall or with the foot soldier casualties, there is no evidence that the higher socialist vote share in 1919 led to lower socialist vote share in 1924. It's slightly positive, but essentially 0 with foot soldier casualties. It's imprecise, negative, but far from significant with rainfall. So instead, I'm not going to show you that because of time constraints, but the vote share comes from the agrarian and the popular parties and the nationalist and the combatant parties that merge with the fascists. And then the second mechanism thing is we look at whether the effects are heterogeneous depending on the support that the fascists received from the elites. As time is short, let me just zero in on the key, which is that we find that the critical early organization is much stronger in places where you have landlord associations, these old style feudalistic landlords, and also in places where entrepreneurs and rentiers are more frequent. But that's not really a super important determinant of 1924 vote share. So this is the story that I was saying. The 1924 is more of this middle class that some historians emphasize, but the early organization was very much dependent on landlord support, the group that felt the Red Scare more. All right, consequences of local fascism. So we collected these data on the deportation of the Jews. Early literature emphasized Jews fared better in Italy, but there were many Jews deported in the 1943-45 period, and so we collect these data. We don't have the local Jewish population everywhere, but we estimate it from 1911 census and some with some interpolation. But without further ado, what we find is that the exogenously induced fascist vote share in 1924 strongly predicts the more effective, the more active deportation of Jews, either number of Jews deportation or whether there were any Jews deported. We find all of them to be statistically significantly correlated. Finally, let me show this picture, which are the vote shares in the post-war parliamentary elections of Communist Party, left vote share, essentially Communist Party and Socialist Party later, center-right vote share, which is Christian Democrats, extreme left vote share to the left of the communists, and extreme right vote share like the movement Social Italian, MSI, etc., or the neo-fascists. The big picture here is that the Christian Democrats lose a lot in places where we have this exogenous shift. And our interpretation is that because the right wing fell behind the fascists, they lost some legitimacy, and this helped the Communist Party or the center left, essentially, as it was in the Italian. This effect starts dying down sometime around the early 1990s, late 1990s. Okay, let me conclude. So I think this is mostly a historical paper shedding light on a critical question. But I think it's also relevant for the current context that if indeed there were many special aspects of the rise of fascism, the military atmosphere, the fact that there were there was new democracy, new mass movements, as some scholars like Ortega y Gasset had emphasized, but also a very militarized environment. Those were very important. But the fascists' sort of way of presenting themselves as a defense against socialists, so sort of a scare that to which they were reacting to, was very important. So that suggests that to the extent that some of those lessons are applicable to today, polarization might be a particularly important thing if, again, it can be presented as a scare from the other side for the fascists, or for the right-wing populists today, potentially turning more extreme. So let me stop there, and Giacomo, Pepe, and I will take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daron. I'm not muted, so I can clap for the whole audience. I suggest that the audience now raises questions. We have about 15 minutes. Thanks for perfect timing, Daron, again.
I'm going to stop sharing, I think.
Okay.
Or perhaps, no. Let me not stop sharing, because there might become questions for
people may
need to go back to
back to specific slides. So when people are raising hands, so Marialina can promote them to panelists, and only panelists, unfortunately, can ask questions. I would ask this question, which was asked by Guido Tabellini a couple of times, actually, exactly about polarization, something that you started talking about in your concluding slide. Could that be the case that the casualties actually contributed to the rise of both extreme left socialists and extreme right fascists? Couldn't be just not this two-step change, but rather a simultaneous increase in extremism where the center would lose towards both extreme left and extreme right?
That's an excellent question, and certainly there is some evidence. So let me go back to this. Some evidence of that in the post-war period. So the bottom two panels are the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing vote share. And you see that it's not uniform across elections, but in some elections you see both of them actually getting more vote share. And these are really extreme. The left here is to the left of the Communist Party. But during the period we're looking at, it seems more staggered. So in the 1919, there is no increase in the vote share of the Nationalist Party or the Fascist Party, which again, we talked about. The Fascist Party was very small. It did not compete everywhere, but there's no vote share either by itself or put together. And in 1924, there was no increase or decrease in the vote share of the Socialist Party. So this doesn't deny that within the Socialists, it might have been the more extremist elements that have gained local ascendancy, but at least in the whole, the staggered pattern is more interesting to us. But certainly, I think one would need to look at whether local branches of the Socialist Party had remained more hardline in some places versus others, depending on the experience of the war. And that would be a very interesting, more historical project.
Excellent, thanks. We actually gave a mic to Guido, so if you have another question, Guido, or you want to talk about this one, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Daron. I have a follow-up question on that.
Please.
I wonder what the data on the 1919 vote shares are really meaning for the fascist and for the nationalist, because the fascists did not have their own lists except in a few places, and the nationalists were not as politically organized. So whereas the socialists and communists were already politically organized in 1919. So the fact that you don't see an effect in 1919 on those nationalist and fascist vote shares could just reflect the fact that these were not very politically organized.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Guido. But we can look at other parties. I think we did look at them, but I don't remember now for the 1919 election. But we did not find any, I don't remember any notable pattern of a right-wing swing in some places that suffered more casualties. Again, I think you are right that there were undoubtedly veterans and combatants who were very hardline nationalists, but my claim is somehow that that's not the source of variation we're exploiting. But you're right, that would not obviate the possibility that the war itself may have created more polarization. It's that our source of variation within the war perhaps is not completely the same as that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next question, Hans-Joachim Vogt.
Hi, Daron.
Hey, hi, Joachim. How are you doing?
So, fascinating work. I'm wondering a little bit about the model you have in the back of your mind, driving effect. So, as I understand it, Italy actually has proportional representation. So, the idea that the local vote share somehow directly influences the risk of the communist takeover, I think, is a little bit stretched. And I thought the Red Scare was much more about the Red Terror, local violence by communist thugs and so forth, than about people getting scared about electoral results. And I was wondering if there was any way to make that empirically tractable.
That's an excellent question.
Red Square.
That's an excellent question. So I should have been more explicit on that. It's, as I pointed out, it's proportional representation, but the proportional representation also says that it's the local support for the same lists, essentially. So you're seeing where it is that you're seeing locally more of a socialist increase. So in the spirit of people are reacting more to the things that they're seeing locally, when there is a huge swing in favor of the Socialist Party, that's going to make them more react more to the socialist threat. Now, you're right that early on during 1919 and 1920, so far as I understand, there was socialist violence too, and the fascist violence was in some sense a reaction to it, but the socialist leaders soon realized that there was no way that they were going to keep up with the fascists, and by the early 1920s, the socialist violence had ceased. Essentially, they had left the field to the fascists. So I think that doesn't say that that could not have had lingering effects, but the key violent actors in the 1920s were the squadres of the fascist party.
Thanks, Daron. This was also a question raised by other people, including Valentino Larcinese. Next question, Riccardo Polisi, please.
So I was wondering about the mechanics of at the local level. So there's a very nice book it's called M, for the issue of Mussolini by Scurati, which is an history of fascism, of the rise of fascism. And the point is, I was wondering, in kind of a process tracing kind of way, if you can find out the places where you have leaders of the Socialist or Communist Party that become leaders of the Fascist Party. And this might play out in the sense of either moving socialist votes to the fascist side, because you have a leader of the socialists that goes to the fascists, or it's just a matter of, again, more votes that concentrate on the fascist party on the right. So whether these guys that appear randomly and become fascists and were before socialists play a micro role in the way the consensus would change in 1924.
That's a great question, Ricardo. That's we'll follow up on that. By the way, Pepe and Giacomo, please feel free to jump in. Don't let me monopolize the answers.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Giacomo, you want to add anything? No. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, did it. Yeah, I don't think. Thank you. It's a great question. I don't think we have any evidence that people that were in the Socialist Party after the war actually moved and joined the fascists in any significant number. There were, of course, a support from the revolutionary left that went to the fascists, but these were the people that essentially supported also that were interventionists that supported Italy in the war, in the 15-18 war. But there is no significant movement afterwards. The only movement that that we read about was essentially under the threat of violence, some cooperatives and local local unions became fascist, but essentially under the threat of violence. But there is no significant movement of socialists towards the fascists in the leadership.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. There was a question raised by actually several people, including Ricardo, whether you looked into the correlations with Spanish flu victims and exposure to Spanish flu. Is that something you can talk about?
That's another good suggestion. No, we have not.
Right. Thanks. Next question.
Very, very topical during the time of COVID-19.
Yes, I know. You always have a paper on everything, but there is a new paper by Daron on COVID, but not on Spanish flu yet, I guess. Next question from Olga Shvesova.
Thank you. Daron, you stated, could you please repeat again, what is the story of agency? Do elites mobilize after 19, or do they just vote themselves?
Yeah, I think there is some debate on that in the history literature. So several historians emphasize that there is some mobilization of elites. And so for example, this is the sort of some of the quotes that I included: the old landowning class being particularly scared of the Red Scare, or the early sort of effects is, like from the Vico Montavani, the resources of fascism are notoriously to be found in the wallets of every trader, industrialist, farmer, or patriot, or that the expansion of fascism in the rural areas was stimulated and directed by the farmers and landowners against peasant leagues. So there is some evidence of that, but there is disagreement in the literature. And I guess our empirical results, but now we're looking at heterogeneous effects, so they have to be a little bit more carefully caveated. But our results are showing that the early organization is much stronger in places where you have these landowner associations or strong elite presence, but the vote share doesn't seem to be very heterogeneously affected.
Thanks. Probably the last question that, since we are running out of time, is by Kaushik Datta.
Daron, thanks for nice study, nice presentation. My question is more related. I'm more trying to understand how I relate your study to present deaths around COVID situation, and whether this death has some political implication too, like the study which you presented.
That's an excellent question. So I think any extrapolation from this has to be extremely speculative. But part of the reason why Pepe, Giacomo, and I jumped onto this project is because both for the Italian context and the German context, we thought that polarization and the ability of the center right or the extreme right to say, well, we are trying to stop the socialists or the communists from rising was an important element. And I think that has current connotations, but it's impossible to know whether really in the current context, either any type of left-wing parties or any other aspects of the left, could be the Antifa movement in the US or Bernie Sanders in the US or some other source, is really any type of red scare. I probably not. Now there's a broader frame which I would not feel comfortable pushing, but it's certainly worth investigating in the future, is that really it's not socialist scare, but any scare that gives impetus to fascism. So if that's the case, the Spanish flu aspect would be relevant in the interwar period, but in the current period, anything that creates huge uncertainty or huge fear, such as COVID-19 deaths, would be a potential driver of further rise in the right-wing vote. Leo Burstein has some interesting papers showing, that so far it's actually the opposite, that people who are supporters of Trump, especially his most vocal supporters such as Sean Hannity, are definitely not taking COVID-19 seriously and are not sufficiently scared of it, but it might change. And I think that's an interesting question that you're raising that one should study.
Thank you very much, Daron. I wanted to ask a question about external validity, but you have answered that. And so we still have something like 13 unanswered questions in Q&A and 35 answered questions by Giuseppe and Giacomo. So it helps to have two co-authors, but judging by the magnitudes, you need more. So once again, thank you so much for being our first speaker in this seminar. That's been a fascinating paper and a very engaging discussion. So thanks again. We will have the next seminar on June 3rd at the same time, and Guido Tabellini will talk about economic shocks and populism. So very much related to what Daron was talking about, probably about more recent events. And thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining. I think it's been a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. And I look forward to listening to Guido in a month.
Thank you.